Oh man, I'm so ready. I'm so ready.
Maybe depending upon the quality of the chocolate.
Yeah, I haven't had anything.
We can take it on.
The subcommittee will come to order. After recognizing myself and Ranking Member Deutsch for 5 minutes each for our opening statements, I will then recognize other members seeking recognition for 1 minute. We will then hear from our witnesses. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself for 5 minutes. This hearing has become especially timely. In recent days, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain have taken serious diplomatic actions against the Gulf Cooperation Council, GCC nation of Qatar. This move surely raised a lot of eyebrows, but it shouldn't come as a surprise. Many of us on this subcommittee have been calling attention to Qatar's history of financing terror, including its support for Hamas and its unwillingness to enforce existing sanctions against individuals within its borders. In fact, nearly 3 years ago, this subcommittee held a hearing on Qatar's support for Hamas and other extremist groups, and we raised many of the same issues that Saudi Arabia, UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain also have raised. Shortly after the hearing, I sent a letter along with Ranking Member Deutsch and Ted Poe and Brad Sherman, and signed by 20 other colleagues of the Foreign Affairs Committee to the Treasury Department in 2014, urging more action against Qatar and Turkey for their roles in terror financing. And with no objection, I would like to include this letter into the record. Thank you. Qatar has long been a permissive terrorist financing environment, and if nothing else, this Saudi-led response will at least get the conversation started. This is the same Qatar which has was entrusted to monitor the Taliban 5, even though we knew it continued to fund ISIS, Hamas, the Taliban, the Muslim Brotherhood, and countless other extremist groups. This is a conversation that we need to be having. We cannot continue to allow Qatar to get away with all that it does against our interests, just because we worry about the consequences of our U.S. base station there. Of course, it's an important consideration, but let's not make it the only consideration. Much like we shouldn't be overlooking Turkey's support for terror groups like Hamas, because Turkey is a NATO ally that houses also a large U.S. military base, or Turkey's negative impact throughout the region, working against our interests, which includes the unhelpful measure its parliament approved recently to send troops to Qatar, a move that will surely upset our partners in the region. And while it is true that Saudi Arabia has presented us with similar problems in the past, the kingdom has prioritized its security cooperation efforts with the U.S. to fight extremism. During the previous administration, there seemed to have been a concerted effort to realign not just our traditional alliance with Saudi Arabia, but to elevate Iran, a U.S.-designated state sponsor of terror. We're all too familiar with the quote attributed to President Obama in an article last year where he insisted that Saudi and Iran should share the same neighborhood and institute some sort of cold peace, end quote. And I asked, share the neighborhood with the foremost state sponsor of terror, how is that a good plan for regional stability? Because while Saudi Arabia is a key partner in our effort to fight ISIS and violent extremism, Iran has worked at every turn to undermine the stability of the region and foment terror. From its support of the Houthis in Yemen to its support for Hezbollah, a group which the Arab League, led by Saudi Arabia, designated as a foreign terrorist organization last year, and its support for Assad in Syria, Iran is working against almost every objective we share with Saudi Arabia. It is no secret that in the lead up to, during, and after the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, our relations with Saudi Arabia and the rest of the GCC were strained, and we reviewed Iran. I hope that the President's recent trip shows that we perhaps have turned that corner. That's not to say that we should turn a blind eye to the kingdom's shortcomings, particularly its troublesome human rights record. On women's rights, much more needs to be done, my goodness, to ensure a more inclusive society. Instead of arresting opposition dissidents, the kingdom must allow for the free exchange of ideas and the free space for all Saudi citizens to express their thoughts. Instead of jailing human rights defenders and activists and those calling for reform, the kingdom must welcome their calls and listen to their ideas in order to implement real reforms. The Saudis allege that their Vision 2030 plan will do just that, and with the Vision 2030 plan, Saudi Arabia has shown that it recognizes that it can no longer rely on its old model of governance, because we all know that there's a large youth population in Saudi Arabia, and if we see the Vision 2030 start to take shape and strengthen the viability of the kingdom's future, we have a better chance of steering them away from extremism. I look forward to hearing from our panel, who between them have a wealth of knowledge and experience with the intricacies of the U.S.-Saudi alliance on how we can advance our own national security interests and objectives in the region together with the Saudis. I now turn to the ranking member, Mr. Deutsch of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thanks to our truly esteemed panel for being here today, and thanks to every one of you for your service. We're greatly appreciative of the work of our American diplomats, and I hope that we continue to rely on the experienced diplomats and recognize the importance of diplomacy, and that we have an opportunity to show that as we move into the budget season. Our relationship with Saudi Arabia is no doubt vital to the Middle East. We should be clear from the outset that we are allies and we share common goals, but we should be honest in assessing where those goals and interests diverge. The President's trip to Saudi Arabia was welcome. Few could argue that this President needs to do outreach to the Arab world. The visit provided a clear message to Iran that the United States stands united with our Gulf allies against its dangerous and destabilizing behavior in the region. The affirmation of cooperation on counterterrorism and a commitment to increasing regional interoperability and bolstering the defenses of our ally were important signals to send. But the President's decision to focus solely on security issues was a mistake. While Saudi Arabia has made slow progress on human rights, failing to acknowledge abuses occurring in the kingdom gave the impression to the world that the United States is willing to forsake human rights, justice, and equality when the messaging is inconvenient. It is true that reform has begun, albeit slowly, and we should praise and encourage those reforms, particularly when it comes to women's rights. Raising human rights is not about lecturing another country. It affects all aspects of our relationship. Foreign businesses are skittish to enter a country where they fear corruption or lack of transparency. This kind of investment and diversification is critical to the Saudis' Vision 2030, which we should be actively supporting. Jobs for youth and the middle class are key to economic stability, which, as we have seen across the region, in turn helps stem the tide of extremism. Moreover, the administration's visits seem to empower the Saudis and others to move ahead with a very public split from Qatar. And Qatar's behavior has been problematic, and we have long struggled to rein in its affinity for harboring terrorists. We should push back against Al Jazeera's biased coverage and promotion of groups that destabilize its neighbors. Qatar's relations with Iran are clearly troubling for a region in which Iran seeks to sow instability. However, I'm concerned that this crisis could have negative impacts on our interests, particularly the operation of the U.S.-led coalition fighting in Syria. Today gives us an opportunity to unpack some of these issues, like what leverage we have with respect to Qatar's support of terrorism and the importance of unity in the GCC to U.S. strategic objectives. We should be viewing our relationship with Saudi Arabia through the prism of our own interests. How mutually beneficial is our relationship? Where do our priorities align? The Saudis have been preoccupied with their campaign in Yemen, which they rightfully see as a direct threat to their national security. The U.S. is right to support the defense of Saudi's borders. Instability inside the kingdom will threaten the region, and we share the concern that Iran is using the Houthis as a proxy. But in terms of our own national security, it has long been AQAP operating in Yemen that has been thought to be the most dangerous branch of al-Qaeda. The conflict in Yemen has also taken the Saudis and others' attention away from the fight against ISIS, arguably our greatest threat at this time. Ambassadors, I know you have been intimately involved in trying to resolve the Yemen conflict over the past 5 years. If no political solution is on the horizon, how can we best support the Saudis while ensuring that the laws of armed conflict are obeyed? Without being a formal member of the coalition, what leverage do we really have? And I've been deeply troubled by the reports of civilian casualties throughout this campaign. The decision to move forward with the sale of precision-guided missiles has raised a host of issues surrounding the Saudis' capabilities to use these weapons in a way that minimizes collateral damage. I am not sure the Congress has been convinced that these weapons can be used appropriately. Our colleagues, Mr. Liu and Mr. Yoho, have been leading the effort here to get an accurate assessment of the progress that the Saudi Royal Air Force has made in its adherence to a no-strike list and, frankly, have yet to receive adequate answers from the administration. Furthermore, I have real concerns that the sale of offensive weapons like the PGMs and the announced $110 billion arms deal do not provide the Saudis with the real defensive capabilities they need to protect and defend their borders or increase counterterrorism operations. Frankly, we don't know yet enough about the proposed sale or how it will affect Israel's qualitative military edge. And following the signing of the JCPOA in 2015, the Obama administration launched an effort to bolster defense in the Gulf. The U.S.-GCC strategic partnership aimed to strengthen missile and cyber defense, along with a host of other technical support from the U.S. Where are we on those deliverables that could help our allies defend themselves against real threats? Finally, being an ally does not mean being given a blank check. We must ensure that we are supporting our allies and making decisions that are in our best interest first and foremost. There are no shortage of issues to discuss today. We have certainly assembled an all-star team of experts, and I look forward to a very productive discussion. And I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch, for that thoughtful opening statement. Now we'll turn to our other members for their opening statements, starting with Mr. Shabbat of Ohio.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. The U.S.-Saudi Arabia relationship has been noticeably strained in recent years. The degree of discord between the previous administration, the Obama administration, and Saudi leadership, it was only exacerbated by a number of things: oil prices, the growing threats of terrorism in the region, differences over the Iranian nuclear program, which I tend to believe that the Saudis were right and the Obama administration was wrong on that one. And although it may not see eye to eye on everything with our Saudi partners, there's no question that having their support in the fight against terror in the region is very, very important. I'm encouraged by President Trump's trip to Saudi Arabia, and I believe it could be a great opportunity to strengthen the U.S.-Saudi relationship while recognizing the Saudis' shortcomings in a number of areas. For example, funding mosques across the globe, some of which have tolerated, if not promoted, radical fundamentalist ideology, and that has been a real problem, and as well as the suppression of women in their own society. That's just intolerable. It continues to be, even though there have been some improvements, they're few and far between. So there's a whole range of issues that we need to focus on. I apologize. I have several hearings happen at the same time. I won't be able to stay for the whole hearing, but thank you for holding this important hearing, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Connolly is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and welcome to our panel. I don't know that I agree with my friend from Ohio, though he and I often agree. I don't know that I'm as heartened by the Trump visit to Saudi Arabia as he is, because I'm worried about what was not discussed, including basic human rights, including the rights of women, including the suppression of LGBT rights, including the right to assemble, including the right to have political opposition. Saudi Arabia has been an anchor and a counterweight to Iran that has served our interest, and I think have served for some stability in that region. But that doesn't change history. The Saudis, at the same time, while condemning Qatari support for terrorism, have financed Wahhabism, extreme Wahhabism, all over the Muslim world. And it has actually destabilized societies in some cases, and certainly been a source of radicalism throughout. 15 of the 19 hijackers in 2001 were Saudis. Osama bin Laden, the mastermind of that attack, was a Saudi. We have to look at this relationship clear-eyed. We have interests, they have interests, but it's anything but a perfect or stable relationship. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Connolly. I have here Mr. Schneider for any opening, any Republican.
Thank you.
Mr. Schneider is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and as have my colleagues, I want to thank the panel, a truly extraordinary panel on a very important issue. As we look at this region and the important relationship with Saudi Arabia. The recent announcement of the new strategic partnership for a 21st century obviously draws much attention, and as was previously stated, as we look to have this conversation today, I hope we'll touch on the impact it's going to have in the region, in particular with respect to preserving Israel's qualitative military edge in a dangerous region, but also, as you have talked about in your written testimony, the importance of U.S. interests, our strategy, what are our priorities and goals, and what is the best strategy to address those. And I think we have to look at those in the broad context of the region, not just as was mentioned with what's going on with Qatar, but Iran and JCPOA, Yemen, Syria, but also the generational challenges within Saudi Arabia and the region, in particular with respect to Vision 2030. So again, I thank the witnesses, I thank the chairman and ranking member for calling this hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Rohrbacher of California.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the witnesses. I'm going to be paying close attention to what you have to say. Over these last 30 years, there's been nothing more perplexing than our relations with countries like Saudi Arabia and like Qatar, realizing that, for example, my colleague just said, of the hijackers, 15 of the 19 hijackers on 9/11 were Saudis, and I happen to believe that Saudis financed 9/11 as well. And so we need your advice as to how we should deal with a situation like that. What is not just the problem, but what's our policy going to be to take Saudi Arabia away from supporting terrorists and Qatar away from supporting terrorists? What do we do to achieve that goal? That should be our main goal. So thank you very much. I'll be paying attention to your advice.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rohrbacher. And we're so pleased to be joined by the chairman of our full committee. But first, we will go to Mr. Cicilline for his statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen and Ranking Member Deutsch, for calling this hearing on Saudi Arabia, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to hearing your testimony. Saudi Arabia has captured our attention in many ways recently, so this hearing comes at an opportune time. The President chose to make his first foreign trip to Saudi Arabia, and although the administration has not established a clear policy towards Saudi Arabia, what they didn't say sent its own message. Neither the President nor any senior administration officials held Saudi leaders accountable for their enduring reckless disregard for human rights, nor does it seem there was any discussion about the quickly deteriorating humanitarian situation in Yemen, where Saudi Arabia has engaged in an extended campaign with U.S. support against Houthi rebels. Saudi Arabia's recent decision, along with other members of the GCC, to cut ties to Qatar, the site of the El Udeid Air Base, which houses the biggest concentration of U.S. military personnel in the Middle East, is troubling, and the Trump administration's handling of this serious situation has been ham-fisted and confounding. The relationship with Saudi Arabia, a partner with whom we sometimes are at odds, is extremely important and equally complex. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, to hear their perspectives on this administration's engagement thus far and their recommendations for how we move forward. And thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. And we've been joined, as I said, with the presence of the full committee chairman, Mr. Royce of California, and he's recognized for as much time as he'd like. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I do thank you for holding this important hearing. And let me just make an observation at the outset here, and that is Qatar's relationship with Hamas remains very concerning. Senior leaders of Hamas and the military wing of the Muslim Brotherhood, which is an Islamist group designated as terrorists by Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and the United Arab Emirates, all reside in Qatar today. And earlier this month, and I think this is what's most concerning for all of us here, more Hamas tunnels were found under 2 UN Relief Works agencies' schools in Gaza, found underneath the schools in Gaza. So Hamas is still using civilians and children to hide its activities. And that, to me, does not sound like a legitimate resistance movement. And it's deeply concerning that in the face of mounting international pressure, Qatar has doubled down on its relationship with Hamas. Just a day ago, Qatar's foreign minister called Hamas a legitimate resistance movement. And that's one of the reasons why I have joined with Ranking Member Engel and Representative Brian Mast and Representative Josh Gottheimer and several other members of this committee in introducing the Palestinian International Terrorism Support Prevention Act. This bill will impose sanctions on foreign persons and agencies, and yes, on governments, that assist Hamas or assist Palestinian Islamic Jihad or the affiliates of these two groups. And specifically, this legislation will sanction anyone that provides Hamas with diplomatic or financial support or who shelters their operatives. This practice needs to end now. There is no such thing as a good terrorist group. And I thank the Chairman Emeritus for yielding to me, and I yield back.
Thank you so much for those welcome remarks. And I hope that we can move that legislation along. Thank you, Mr. Royce. Ms. Frankel of Florida.
Thank you very much, and thank you to my colleagues from Florida, the chair and ranking member. And thank you all for being here. I tell you, and I look forward to your testimony. I just wanted to state a concern that I have that maybe you will be able to address. And that is, and I wish there was someone from the State Department here, because I would ask them directly. And that is the coordination, or maybe the lack of coordination, between the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, and the State Department in regards to the relationship between Saudi Arabia and their alliance and Qatar. We know that Saudi Arabia just announced with the coalition the cutting of ties to Qatar. And then it seemed like the president said, our president said that was a great thing. And then you had the Secretary of State basically trying to calm the waters. And so I'm a little confused. I don't really know what the United States position is. So I'd be interested to know if any of you know what the United States position is. And I think today, just today, our ambassador to Qatar had resigned because I don't think he knows what the position, she resigned because I don't know if she knows what the position of the United States is supposed to be. So I would be interested in knowing if you know what it is, and I also would like to know what you think it should be. And I yield back.
Thank you so much, Ms. Frankel. And I'd like to note that we have been trying to get the State Department for years to come in front of our subcommittee to talk about Saudi Arabia, but that's not been successful. We've been calling the wrong folks, Mr. Connolly? Okay. There's no one there. Thank you. And now I am so pleased. Are there any other members? I'm so pleased to introduce our witnesses. We have a star-studded panel today. First, we're delighted to welcome Ambassador Joseph Westfall, who served as U.S. Ambassador to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia from March 2014 to January 2017. Dr. Westfall currently works as a Senior Global Fellow at the Joseph H. Lauder Institute of Management and International Studies and as a Senior Fellow at the Center for Leadership and Change Management, both at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania. Prior to his appointment, Ambassador Westfall was the Undersecretary of the Army and as Chief Management Officer from 2009 to 2014. Muchas gracias, mi amigo, por estar con nosotros. He's a wonderful friend, and it's great to have him here. Next, we would like to welcome back another great friend, Ambassador Firestein, who was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Near East Affairs and served as U.S. Ambassador to Yemen from 2010 to 2013. Over the course of his career, the ambassador has served in Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Jerusalem, Pakistan, Oman, Tunisia, yikes, all over the place. Mr. Firestein helped develop and implement State Department policies and programs to counter violent extremism. Welcome back, friend. In addition, we'd like to welcome for the first time Mrs. Karen Elliott House. Thank you, ma'am. She is currently a senior fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard's Kennedy School of Management. She authored on Saudi Arabia, Its People, Past, Religion, Fault Lines, and Future. So I think she's a good expert on this. She's also chairman of the board of the RAND Corporation and serves on multiple nonprofit boards, including the Trilateral Commission. We look forward to your testimony, Ms. House. Thank you so much. And we'd like to welcome Mr. Tom Malinowski. Thank you, who served as Assistant Secretary of State for Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor until this year. Prior to his position, he worked as Washington Director for Human Rights Watch, a wonderful organization. Mr. Malinowski served as Senior Director for Foreign Policy Speechwriting at the National Security Council, and we welcome you. We look forward to your testimony. So, Mr. Ambassador, we will begin with you, Mr. Westfall.
Good morning, Madam Chair, Ranking Member Deutsch, distinguished members of the committee. Delighted to be here, delighted to be with you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your introduction. I'm just going to summarize a few points rather than read a statement. And if you think about it, since the Iranian Revolution, and that's nearly more than 4 decades ago, we have been spending a significant amount of our resources, our focus and attention in the Middle East region. And there's no end in sight for that. Not only is it financial resources, but it's human resources, it's stability, it's security, a lot of issues. And all of you touched on a number of things that are critically important for us to be engaged in a more, I think, aggressive fashion if we're going to be able to devote more attention to other critical issues around the world than just what's happening in the Middle East. Funding for terrorist organizations has been something that we have been working on as a country, and I would urge this committee, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Deutsch, to consider perhaps bringing in the Treasury Department, because we have been working with them very extensively. Ambassador Firestein can speak to this as well, on trying to get these Gulf countries and Middle East countries to pass laws and enforce these laws that prevent the movement of money to terrorist organizations. Saudi Arabia, for example, we believe today, and I think Treasury will verify this, has the strongest laws of any country in the Gulf region, mostly because of our efforts and our drive to push that over the last almost 10 years. But we've met it with a lot of success recently. So Qatar has not been a success. Kuwait has been an issue as well, and there are other countries where this needs to be applied more aggressively. And as some of you pointed out, our relationships can't be just about fighting terrorism. They also have to be about a number of other things that affect our security and stability in the region. The fact of the matter is that this discord between the Saudis and the Emirates and Qatar is long-standing. These are tribal countries. They've had issues in the past. They just simply sort of emerged once again. And it is in our interest, and I believe that what Secretary Tillerson said in his brief remarks is the right way to go. I think we have to be more engaged in trying to resolve these issues by getting these countries to have a dialogue, but also to agree, as you said, Madam Chair, to agree to end the funding of terrorist organizations. The Saudis have, for example, imposed a situation where they have done due diligence on charities. So they have a list of charities that one can donate to that are approved by the government. And only those charities can you provide money and resources to as a Saudi. And if you provide to any other charity, you're subject to punishment by law. So they're trying very aggressively to do this. Is it foolproof? I cannot tell you that. I don't know. But I think they're making some efforts to stop the flow of money, at least through formal banking channels. And again, I would urge you to consider talking to Treasury about that. The war in Yemen, another issue you brought up, continues to be a real problem for a lot of reasons, not just the human resources issue and humanitarian issues. We got very, very close to some settlement of Yemen, and again, Ambassador Firestein is far more knowledgeable than anybody around here on this issue, but having served there. But there were times when we came very close in recent past to perhaps coming with an agreement, working with the government of Oman, and especially with the UN Special Envoy, who has done a phenomenal job of trying to bring everybody together. And as we got close, then things would break open. So I think we need to continue that effort, working with all of the countries. The relationship between Oman and Saudi is not a great relationship, and we need to empower these countries to work together to resolve these issues. As some of you stated, they need to work at it. So I think that's an area where we need to do. On the PGM issue, which is going to come up today in the Senate, and will undoubtedly come to the House for your vote on it, and it'll be an important issue. We labored with this issue of how do we provide munitions, offensive munitions, to a country when at the same time we're trying to get them to reduce their military operations and come up with some kind of an agreement with the Houthis and perhaps Ali Abdullah Saleh's forces there, and some resolution without dividing the country. So I think our efforts there ought to be to push hard. If you are going to receive these systems from us, these PGMs from us, then we insist that we are going to need to work harder to train your forces on how to use them. So we're not going to just deliver munitions and that's the end of it. We need to be more engaged in helping them. And again, State Department was doing that. DRL was doing a lot on trying to train them on how to look at civilian casualties and assess their operations. So there's a lot more we can do than just sell them a weapons system without any constraints. We can put a lot of constraints. And then I'll just stop here and say, there's a lot more to discuss. We need to talk about the transformation plan. It's important for both human resources issues as well as military and security issues. There's a lot of things that we ought to be doing more aggressively to partner up with Saudi Arabia. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Ambassador Firestein, we'll go with you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify about an issue of considerable importance related to U.S. foreign policy and national security interests, not only in the Middle East but globally. Since the end of the Second World War, the U.S.-Saudi relationship has been a principal pillar of regional security and stability. It has joined the U.S. in resisting expansionism, advocated moderate solutions to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, and cooperated in the fight against violent extremism and terrorism. Likewise, Saudi Arabia's role in ensuring price and production stability in the oil market has contributed to overall economic growth and stability around the world for decades. In recent years, our relationship has frayed over differences from the Arab Spring to human rights, Iran to Syria. Even Yemen, despite a fundamental agreement on the nature of the conflict and the legitimacy of Saudi intervention, became a source of bilateral friction. Seeing the arrival of the Trump administration as an opportunity to repair the damaged relationship, the Saudis made clear their support for the three core regional policy objectives identified by the administration: the fight against violent extremism, a united front challenging Iran, and help on achieving progress in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
In Riyadh, the two sides announced billions of dollars in new economic cooperation, including bilateral investments designed to advance each side's domestic political goals. For its part, the Trump administration made clear that it would roll back some of the restrictions placed on defense cooperation by the Obama administration and restore arms sales as well as intelligence and logistics cooperation with the Saudi military. It's premature to assess the significance of the new era of cooperation, however. Despite the positive indications, subsequent developments, including the current intra-GCC tensions with Qatar, have reinforced the view that much of the progress advertised in Riyadh remains nascent and tenuous. Among the most well-received elements in Trump's speech to the assembled Arab and Islamic leaders May 21st was his promise that his administration would refrain from lectures on human rights and civil liberties. Many of the leaders had viewed the Obama administration's emphasis on these issues as overweening and overly sanctimonious. But the proper way to restore the balance in our approach is not to adopt a values-free foreign policy. The U.S. is locked in a battle of ideas with those who believe that there is a model of development that permits rapid economic progress while retaining authoritarian political systems. The U.S. needs to push back on that notion and make clear that the values we advocate are central to our conception of the appropriate relationship between the government and its citizens, because they reflect a system of political behavior, time-tested, that produces stable, durable, and just societies. Saudi Arabia represents a particularly difficult challenge for the U.S. on human rights issues. Its society is built around fundamentally different conceptions of social relationships and civil rights. We have made little progress over the years in convincing them that our approach will help them build a stronger society, and there is little evidence to suggest that the majority of Saudis agree with us rather than their government on these issues. Vision 2030, however, presages not only a dramatic replacement of the public sector by the private sector as the main engine of economic development, it also signals a fundamental shift in the traditional relationship between the government and its citizens that can become a driver for a revamped approach to civil liberties and human rights. Thus, economic reality, rather than political or social reform, may become the main instrument for a new, more open Saudi society. In conclusion, as the U.S. seeks to restore stability and security in the Middle East, defeat violent extremism, and roll back Iranian expansionism, Saudi Arabia will remain a vital partner. But Saudi Arabia itself is at a crossroads, and the country will necessarily devote its energy primarily to addressing internal challenges in the coming years. Through quiet diplomacy, the U.S. can contribute to the kind of economic and social initiatives that will enable political reforms, leaving Saudi Arabia a more open, democratic society. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to responding to your questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. Ms. House.
Thank you. Like Ambassador Westfall, I'm going to simply, can you hear me now? Like Ambassador Westfall, I'm going to simply make some points. As has been said by some of you and the witnesses, there are enormous uncertainties in the Middle East now about the stability of borders, about the economic, outmoded economic systems, and can they provide jobs, as the chairwoman said, for this bulge of young people. Those power vacuums are being exploited by both Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are in competition for influence in the region. And the fact that the U.S. had little strategy or engagement in the region over the past at least half dozen years, other than promoting the securing of a nuclear deal with Iran, has left the whole region like a unruly schoolyard. With no teacher on duty, the biggest bully is the winner. And I think it's important that we all understand right now Iran is winning this competition. And it is not in the interest of the U.S. For Saudi Arabia to be destabilized or feel unsupported. So President Trump's visit to the region has clearly signaled that the U.S. is back in the game and back on the side of Saudi Arabia. The Saudis and everyone else, as the ambassador said, it's too early to say that this is a lasting change with lasting impact, because it will take more than a high-profile visit to actually rebuild the trust that was so badly destroyed over the last half dozen years, and the consequences of that. The decision by the president to back the Saudis and their colleagues against Qatar does signal that he is willing to engage, that he means what he says about reducing extremism in the region. And as has already been said, the support of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hezbollah, Hamas, all by Iran and Qatar, has to be a source of concern and something that the U.S. seeks to counter. A year ago, the Saudis were fundamentally in a crouched position, feeling unsupported, and at least now they are upright with the sense that the U.S. is behind them and beginning to at least shadow box with Iran and Qatar and their adversaries. I want to spend my last minute and a half focused on the domestic Vision 2030, because I have just come back from 3 weeks there, and I think it is also important that we understand things are changing in Saudi Arabia, not as fast as we might wish, but the opportunities offered to women, the fact that the government has banned the religious police from arresting people for being unveiled or gender mixing, has produced a quite, in my view, remarkable relaxation, even in Riyadh, one of the most conservative places. Black abayas are obviously meant to mask a woman's figure. You now see young women not only abandoning black, but fitting them at the waist, making the figure very revealed, or walking around with them completely open, showing their tight T-shirts and Levi's. I don't mean to make too much out of just a dress code change, but it is significant in a country where, unlike here, individualism is prized. There, being part of the group and not stepping outside is what's prized. And the fact that people are courageous enough to begin to do these things, I think we shouldn't diminish. So I believe that Vision 2030 and supporting economic reform, which I believe they now must do because oil prices aren't likely to recover, is one way the U.S. can begin to expand human rights in the kingdom. And I agree with what's already been said, that we should make clear that it is important for people to have the right to free speech, but Saudis are taking it more and more on Twitter and the internet, so that there is something of a virtual opposition. And yes, the government still arrests people who get too critical, and we should make clear that we don't agree with that. But this is an opportunity for the U.S. to both help stabilize and change Saudi Arabia by supporting Vision 2030 and helping them deal with change internally and when they have all these external problems. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. House. Mr. Malinowski.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, members. Thank you.
Could pull that microphone a little closer.
Sorry, is that good?
Maybe that whole little gizmo.
All right.
Put it.
Thank you for having me today. I fully agree that it is important for us to try to have a good relationship with Saudi Arabia. We have a lot of interest in common. We've done a lot to try to deepen our partnership with the Saudis over the last several years, and it is perfectly reasonable for a new administration to try to improve the relationship further. At the same time, I think we have to be honest that Saudi Arabia's agenda in the Middle East is not identical to our own. Where there's overlap, we should try to cooperate, and where there is not, we should be guided by our interests and values. How we engage with Saudi Arabia is also symbolically important around the world. My responsibilities at the State Department were global, and I think I may want to begin with this point because it's something that I saw in my engagement with countries all over the world. I think all of us agree, judging from the various statements, that defending human rights and democratic freedoms in the world, it's part of who we are as a country and very much in our interest. Doing this in Saudi Arabia is obviously very, very challenging. But as someone who led our government's efforts to promote our values around the world, let me stress this as strongly as I can. We cannot have a credible global human rights policy unless we also apply it somehow to Saudi Arabia. In almost every authoritarian country I dealt with as Assistant Secretary, people would ask me, do you criticize your Saudi allies the way you criticize us? Assuming the answer would be no. Fortunately, the answer was yes. Although we may not do it as loudly in Saudi Arabia as we do in some places, we have pressed the Saudis on dissidents, on women's and migrants' rights, on religious freedom, on the war in Yemen. I would not have had a leg to stand on with Russia or China or Iran or Cuba if I couldn't have said that. And that's why President Trump's very clear public message in Riyadh that we will no longer press the Gulf states on these issues was so harmful. We can't have a credible global human rights policy if we say to the whole world that we're giving the Saudis a pass. And I think Secretary Tillerson's subsequent, very appropriate criticism of the Iranian elections was deeply undermined by his refusal to say anything at the same time about Saudi Arabia. That is a gift to everybody who wants to portray American advocacy for human rights as just a weapon that we use to beat up our enemies rather than a principled policy that we try to apply to everybody. And I think the problem was compounded by the clear contrast between how the administration is engaged with Saudi Arabia and its treatment of our allies in Europe and elsewhere. It's one thing to go to Saudi Arabia with the legitimate aim of improving our relationship, and I think it was frankly dispiriting and even disgraceful for the president to say in Riyadh that we will not lecture countries in that part of the world, and then to deliver what was clearly a lecture in Brussels to democratic allies that have fought and bled with us all over the world and that share our values about what they allegedly owe to the United States. And I think some corrective from the Congress is needed here. In the meantime, our approach to Saudi Arabia should be based on a realistic assessment of where our aims do and do not coincide. With respect to the current crisis over Qatar, for example, there's absolutely a legitimate concern, as you mentioned, Madam Chairman, about that country's funding to terrorist groups. But I think it would be a mistake to assume that this is the principal reason why Saudi Arabia acted against Qatar, given Saudi Arabia's own extremely complicated, to say the least, relationship with violent extremism. Our interest lies in seeing this dispute resolved peacefully and with concerns about terrorist financing addressed by all sides rather than trying to take sides. With respect to Iran, the United States and Saudi Arabia share a paramount interest in opposing that country's malign influence in the region. But this is about countering the policies of the current regime in Iran. It is not in our interest to be seen more broadly as supporting Saudi Arabia and opposing Iran per se in some kind of zero-sum struggle for dominance in the Middle East. Absolutely, it is not in our interest to be viewed as aligned with Sunnis in an existential struggle with Shia Muslims, or to encourage the formation of an alliance which is defined in sectarian religious terms. We have many Shia friends in the region, in Iraq, who are fighting ISIS, in Bahrain, in Lebanon. Why would we signal to them that we are somehow engaged in, on one side of a religious war? Finally, with respect to Yemen, the United States and Saudi Arabia clearly have a common interest there in combating Iranian influence, in denying safe haven to al-Qaeda, protecting sea lanes. We do not have an interest in giving the Saudis a blank check to make bad decisions for which the United States will then share responsibility. We provided very generous support to the Saudi-led coalition. We've tried to help them improve their performance, including the effort that Ambassador Westfall mentioned that my bureau led on civilian casualties. But the intervention there clearly hasn't achieved its aims. The Saudis have continued to strike targets that exacerbate the humanitarian situation, suggesting they've sometimes made a conscious effort not to follow our advice. There is, as you know, a looming famine in Yemen. This is not an abstraction. Over 3 million people are now suffering acute malnutrition. There are over 100,000 cases of cholera. Saudi strikes on roads, bridges, and ports have kept aid from those in need. We are involved in this. Now, if we think that unconditionally supporting our ally is worth that human cost, then we should honestly say so and accept our share of responsibility for that cost. I personally believe it's not, and that we should therefore temper, not withdraw, but temper our support to the Saudis to encourage an outcome more in keeping with our interest. And I think that is what the vote in the Senate is about today. On all these issues, offering partnership where our interests align and honesty where they do not, in my view, is the best way to build long-term trust and a better relationship with Saudi Arabia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all of our panelists. And for the panel, I'll start the questions. The JCPOA and the previous administration's willingness to elevate the Iranian regime's profile came at the expense of our traditional alliances with the Saudis and the rest of the GCC, and that eroded our credibility. Iran is probably the greatest threat to Saudi Arabia, and it's certainly one of the greatest threats to regional stability and U.S. national security interests. Iran's proxy war in Syria and Iraq and Yemen and the presence of Hezbollah in Lebanon have the entire region on edge. The new administration is intent on reversing the policy of seeing Iran and Saudi Arabia share the neighborhood with supposedly similar beliefs, and we know that that cannot happen. What can Congress do with our Saudi partners to address our mutual concerns with the Houthis, the Iran support for Assad and Hezbollah, and its desire to spread its ideology throughout the region?
Well, Madam Chair, in my 3 years there, I spent quite a bit of time talking to the Saudi leadership, from the king, the crown prince, and deputy crown prince, about the role of Congress. And I think you've touched on something that I think has been, I'm not going to say absent, but something that needs to be really pushed harder, which is your role as the most important branch of government in these matters. So, for example, delegations that can travel, I've been telling the Saudis that it is important for them to hear what you're saying, because you represent the interests of the American people. And you speak for the American people in ways that even presidents can't do, because you all represent different constituents. As such, I think, try to get them to strengthen their relationships, to have a better relationship with their GCC partners, to include countries like Oman, for example, which they see as a link to Iran. To try to understand how they can carry on a GCC dialogue on these issues, much like you do in Congress when you have big differences between parties or ideologies here. You carry on the dialogue. I think that that's important to do. And I think Congress can play a role, not in directing foreign policy, but in shaping it in the future, given all your interests that you represent.
Thank you. Anyone else care to? Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. What I would say is that in the region you have two elements that are that are the drivers of instability and the weakening of societies and governments. You have violent extremism on one side, and then you have Iran on the other side. And both of them are fundamentally responsible for destabilizing the region. In my own view, the Iranians and the violent extremist organizations pursue the same tactics and achieve success in the same way, and that is that they take advantage of the weakness of governments and societies in order to exert their influence through money, through military assistance, training. Certainly my experience in Yemen was precisely that Iran was able to establish a foothold, to establish a relationship with the Houthis, primarily because the government of Yemen was weak and was unable to provide for the needs and the demands of their own citizens. And so in my view, the way to push back on Iranian expansionism is the same way that we push back on violent extremism, and that is that we need to help these societies build up their institutional capacity in order to take on their responsibilities and to provide governance, to provide law and order, and to address the needs of their entire population. So I would hope that the Congress, as it's looking at the budget, as it's looking at the requirements moving forward, would continue the longstanding U.S. Position of helping these societies build their states, build their governments, build their institutions, and that is ultimately what's going to allow us to achieve success in these fights.
Thank you. And I know you would have remarks, but my time is up, so I'm pleased to yield to Mr. Deutsch for his time. Thank you.
Thanks, Madam Chairman. More than one of you mentioned the issue of Saudi financing of terrorism, and there was a New York Times piece last year that referred to the Saudis as both the arsonists and the firefighters when it comes to the spread of extremism. Secretary Malinowski, you described the Saudi funding of Wahhabism around the world as having done incalculable damage, even if Saudi leaders have recognized the problem. When Saudi and others are demanding that Qatar change its behavior on terror financing, how do we reconcile these two positions? And is it appropriate to equate what the Saudis do with what the Qataris do? Is one worse than the other? How do we sort that out? Please, Mr. Malinowski.
I never think it's helpful to kind of do a ranking, you know, who's worse than who. Is Iran worse than Saudi Arabia on human rights or vice versa? Or the Qataris or the Saudis worse in terms of the arsonist part of that equation? But I think it is important here to stress that there are a lot of complicated things going on in this dispute between Saudi Arabia and Qatar, and a principled objection to Qatari financing of groups like the ones that you've mentioned, I don't think is really at the very top of the list. And I think if we were to lead with what I think is our core interest here, which is to reduce and eliminate funding for violent extremist groups and the broader phenomenon of tens of billions of dollars emanating primarily from Saudi Arabia to change the character of how Islam is practiced in many parts of the world. If we were to lead with that, we would have a lot to say to every country in the region, including Saudi Arabia. And I hope that this Qatar crisis, rather than inducing us to simplistically take sides with the Saudis and the UAE, forces a deeper examination of those problems.
Well, Ambassador Westfall, I imagine during your tenure this issue arose frequently, and so what's the correlation between the acknowledgement that you receive from leadership that this is a problem and steps that we're actually taking to address it?
Sorry. Well, first of all, the president himself, he made 4 visits, President Obama made 4 visits to Saudi Arabia, and in 3 of those that I sat in, he brought up the issue very directly. Now, he brought it up in terms of the large disparity between the crime and the punishment issue. And then on the funding, Secretary Kerry and others and myself.
Ambassador Westfall, I'm sorry, just I don't question that it was brought up by visits from Secretary Kerry and the President, but what was the response from the Saudis, and to what extent did they acknowledge it, and to what extent did they address it?
They acknowledged the issue, and they addressed it by actually passing a lot of laws, and again, like I said earlier, working with us in multiple meetings through Treasury and our other agencies to try to stop the flow of resources. So they have made some significant progress, in my view.
Great. And just moving on in the remaining time I have, I'd like to be supportive of the U.S.-Saudi alliance. It's critical, but I also believe that it's important for us to ensure that the steps we take to strengthen our allies don't ultimately run counter to our own interests, as I said earlier. And as Congress contemplates this arms sale, starting with the PGMs, help us understand the implications of selling these weapons without having adequate assessment of how the Saudi Air Force can and will use them versus the implications of not selling them and the impression that that would give to Iran. Ms. Hauser, Ambassador Firestein.
On the weapons sales, I would just like to repeat what somebody already said. It's not the selling them weapons that actually does any good, in my view. We need to be working with them to make them a much more efficient and effective military, not largely an employment operation, their Defense Department. I think they understand that and would be willing to cooperate.
Ambassador Firestein on the PGMs.
I believe that we should move forward on the PGM sale. I think that it's important to help the Saudis improve their capability. One of the things that happened over the course of the conflict in Yemen is that we actually withdrew some of the advice and assistance that we were providing to the Saudis in their Air Operations Center. I think we should restore that. It was an important element of how we could help them improve. But the PGMs themselves, if used appropriately, will actually result in reduced civilian casualties and reduced collateral damage. And for that reason, I think we should go forward with it.
Thanks.
Could I just pick up on that? I think do have a small disagreement on this point. PGMs, in principle, can be very helpful in reducing civilian casualties. But that has not been the case in Yemen, because the problem there has not been an absence of precision. The problem there has been that the Saudis have been hitting the wrong targets. If you're hitting a bridge or a medical facility or a port facility that you shouldn't be hitting, having a very precise weapon is not going to help, and that was the reason why we ultimately made the decision to withhold those sales. I'm absolutely in favor of selling defensive weapon systems and a whole host of other things that the Saudis can use to protect their border, but these in particular make us complicit in the strikes that are creating the humanitarian crisis. And I think if that is a priority for us to reduce, then I think we do need to temper it.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam
Thank
Chair.
you, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Donovan of New York.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ambassador Westfall, you had testified before about the Saudis' attempt to curtail terrorist funding by designating specific charities and restricting others. Just last year, our nation gave Iran $1.7 billion. That was designated as $400 million for sales that we had never paid them for in previous decades. And the additional $1.3 billion was the interest on the $400 million that they gained in our financial services community for us retaining that money. There was no restrictions, obviously, on their use of that money, and I think we all suspect how they used that $1.3 billion in interest from American banks. As we look towards our allies, our friends in the Middle East, the people that we're negotiating with, when we look at ourselves, do you think that there's some restrictions that the United States could put into place that could curtail what may end up being our supporting or giving money to some organizations who may use that money then to harm ourselves?
Yes,
Put the microphone on.
I'm sorry. As I was leaving the country and had a conversation with King Salman and the other leadership, we talked about the fact that sanctions against Iran need to be continued and strengthened. Particularly, I think their biggest problem with the agreement with Iran was that we did not negotiate, in addition to the nuclear program, we did not negotiate their activities in the region, in Iraq, in Syria, and in Yemen. They did not understand why President Obama and the administration did not push harder on those issues as part of the agreement. And so we talked about the fact that maybe in this new administration, there can be a more aggressive effort to do that.
And to the rest of the panel, apparently my time is up already. But for the rest of the panel, if I could just ask all three, it started at 1 minute.
Sorry,
instead of 5.
we just messed up the time.
Listen,
Go
you know
ahead.
how long I talk, Chairwoman. Thank you, ma'am. For the rest
Do
of you, I
that for Mark Meadows, but not for New Yorkers. You talk fast.
Thank you very much. For the remaining members of our panel, each of you spoke about the difference in our values that we treasure and hold, in human rights, freedoms of religion, freedoms from persecution, civil rights, women's rights. How do we deal with countries that don't embrace our same values? And at the same time, I guess I'm saying, because we think they're self-governing countries and maybe we should respect their decisions their countries make, it's hard for us to respect what other nations do to women and people who are persecuted because of their religious beliefs. So I'm just curious if you guys have an idea of how we balance those two competing interests.
I have two things that I think are absolutely critically important. The first is primary, secondary education. The Saudis understand that their system is in dire need of help, particularly on teacher development and education and the curriculum. So recently, the Minister of Education declared that religion would be only taught for a very short period of time during school hours, but the curriculum revision needs help. And I offered then that we could help in many different ways. They put out a proposal for teacher development to bring teachers to the United States to mentor their teachers here, and got no takers on the proposal. They're going to put another one out. So education, primary education, is where all this Wahhabism and all of this intense religious teaching took its roots. And if you change that system and you improve education at the lowest levels, not higher education, but lower primary, secondary, important. And the second is their judicial system. They also said to me, we've got old judges, we've got an old system under Sharia law that needs modification, needs reform. We need to help train judges, train prosecutors, train defense attorneys. To do that, you will get a better human rights record. You will get a better record for business. If you're a businessman and you want to do business in Saudi Arabia, you want to make sure your interests are protected and your lawyers can fight for you. Right now, that's not always the case. So we need to help them in those two areas, in my view.
And I just reinforce the education point. It is one of the opportunities for America. I'm shocked to hear that nobody responded. The Canadians are helping retrain teachers. When I was doing my book, they were promising, the Saudis were promising to change the textbooks. But as the man in charge of that told me, when you shut the door and the teacher's in charge, at some level it doesn't matter what the textbook says. So there is a big need for both what the ambassador said, starting at a young age to teach something other than hatred of Jews, Christians, Shias.
Thank you, Ms. House. These New Yorkers, you know, you give them a finger, they take your whole hand. You're out of time. Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
I thank the chair, and welcome to the panel. And I'm going to ask some rapid-fire questions and ask you to be as concise as you can because I want to fit a lot in. Mr. Mr. Ambassador, in listening to Ms. House, I hear this dystopian wreckage of a relationship over the last 6 years, and thank God Donald Trump arrives in Riyadh to try to restore some semblance of order in the relationship. You sat personally in meetings with the President of the United States and the Saudi king, is that correct? 3 times? 4, 3, plus the Secretary of State separately. Yeah. Could it be that some of the trouble in the relationship was the Saudis were hearing things they did not want to hear? Because if I heard your direct testimony, the President personally brought up human rights issues and other issues that matter in terms of U.S. values. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And they don't like hearing that. It was not well received.
You know, the answer...
Real quick.
Okay.
Because I'm going to run out of time, that's all. Go ahead.
The answer is, yes, they didn't want to hear it, but yes, they did take actions, and yes, we did follow up.
Okay. So it was efficacious, even if it wasn't always welcome. Secondly, I think, and I don't mean to put words in Ms. House's mouth, but I assume she was inferring that one of the big problems was JCPOA, that the Saudis, on principle, did not want to see the United States, let alone the Group of Five, engaged with the Iranians on anything. Would the Saudis have preferred a kinetic option, as the military refers to it, rather than a negotiated agreement to try to roll back the nuclear development program?
No, and they clearly said to me, very directly, all of the leaders said, we don't oppose the nuclear agreement, we oppose the fact that nothing else was tied.
Got it. But when we negotiated with the Soviets, we didn't apply that standard. When John Kennedy signed the first nuclear test ban agreement with Nikita Khrushchev, he didn't make it an all-comprehensive agreement because that wouldn't have worked. We didn't try to circumscribe Soviet behavior all over the world. We didn't have a list of objectionable behaviors that, oh, by the way, needs to be included in the nuclear test ban agreement. We built relationships one agreement at a time because that's the way it works. Fair enough? Thank you. Was that a yes on the record?
That's a yes.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Malinowski, would our Ambassador Firestein said that the Saudis see our human rights advocacy and other advocacies for press freedoms and so forth as, quote, overweening and self-righteous sometimes. Gee, we don't want to be seen as overweening or self-righteous, do we? I mean, shouldn't we abandon all of those efforts so that we clear that up and we're no longer seen as self-righteous or overweening?
It would be so much easier, wouldn't it?
Wouldn't it? I mean, that's the argument I hear from Duterte in the Philippines, from President Xi of China, from Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Stay out of our business. Who are you to judge? Why do you bring up these ancillary issues that only cloud the relationship? And I think it's a fair, in terms of the dialectic of foreign policy, American foreign policy, it's a fair question. Always has been, by the way, going back to the founding of the Republic. But the idea that we would abandon our advocacy of our own values, even if it makes other people uncomfortable, is to me a very troubling development in our own foreign policy. And I wonder, since you had that portfolio, whether you want to comment on that.
Sure, and I would note, I think Ambassador Firestein and I agree on this 100%.
Yeah, and I don't mean to say, you weren't advocating, you were describing. I hope I got that right.
Look, nobody, in the business of promoting human rights and democratic values, you cannot be effective and agreeable at the same time. That's almost a truism, because if we are being effective, then an authoritarian regime that doesn't want to change is going to be upset about that. We are actually fairly soft with the Saudis. They are a close ally. We don't yell and scream at them the way we yell and scream at some countries, and sometimes we're criticized for not saying enough, as you well know. But we have raised these issues. We did in the Bush administration. We did in the Obama administration. We were sometimes effective. I think they care about their international reputation. A very interesting example of this is the case of the blogger Raif Badawi, who is still unfortunately in prison in Saudi Arabia, but who was sentenced to 1,000 lashes because he tried to set up a human rights group in the country.
Is that because of Sharia law?
It's because he set up...
Is there Sharia law in Saudi Arabia?
Yes. Yeah.
Sharia law that so many of my friends on the other side of the aisle campaign in the United States against. We don't want to see that here. but it's in our solid ally Saudi Arabia's code. Is that correct?
Well, yes, and of course there are many different interpretations of Sharia law, and as Ambassador Westfall rightly pointed out, there's a huge problem in just the absence of clarity about law and what the judiciary is supposed to do. But in that case, he was sentenced to 1,000 lashes. Outrageously, they subjected him to 50. But I think in part because there is an outcry around the world. This is embarrassing for Saudi Arabia. That sentence has not fully been carried out, and I'm still hopeful that there may be a way, and I hope that the Trump administration will continue our efforts in this to try to get that brave young man out of prison.
My time is up, and I thank you all for your testimony.
Thank you very much, Mr. Connolly. Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much. Just to remind everyone that when John Kennedy made that great agreement with the Russians, yes, it got a lot of people optimistic, but it was followed by some of the worst parts of the Cold War happened immediately after that. The Soviets did not take that as a sign of peace. They took it as a sign of weakness and doubled their support for revolutionary units all over the world. And I would suggest that the mullah regime in Iran, with their now $1.7 billion in cash from the Americans, probably don't think of us as being anything but patsies and weak for doing such a thing. Let me ask about Saudi Arabia. Specifically, do any of our witnesses know if there are still officials in power in Saudi Arabia who were in authority at the time when 3,000 Americans were slaughtered on 9/11? Do we still have any Saudis still in positions of authority that were there when that happened?
Yes, well, the king was the governor of Riyadh, so he was an authority.
He was part of the clique that ran the country then, right?
Well, yeah, he's one of the
Okay,
royal
so
family.
the king, and that's true all the way through, right? We have the same clique running Saudi Arabia that slaughtered 3,000 Americans.
Well, the
and that
most
should be
important young leader right now, Mohammed bin Salman, is only 30, so he was alive, but he was not
well, let's hope
part
that
of
he
the
doesn't.
ruling then.
Let's hope that he doesn't learn from his elders. The fact is that most people who I've talked to believe that the clique that runs Saudi Arabia knew what Osama bin Laden was planning, and they did nothing to stop it. At the worst, they did nothing to stop it. Some of them actually probably participated in helping. So is today that clique in Saudi Arabia helping to finance the Taliban and finance Pakistan, of course, who is financing the Taliban in Afghanistan? Is any of that money from Saudi Arabia going to Pakistan and then thus on to the Taliban?
They've made every effort to stop that funding completely. Taliban.
So they don't give money. Saudi Arabia does not give money now to Pakistan.
No.
Oh, is that right? They cut Pakistan off?
No. Saudi Arabia, as does the United States, of course, provide money to the
That's
government.
correct, over some of our objections, I might add it.
But we do.
So the Saudis are still financing Pakistan, who is the main sponsor of the Taliban and other terrorist groups in that region. And the Saudis are financing it. Some of the officials who are part of the clique before 9/11 are still there. And how about, are they using their wealth, are the Saudis still using their wealth, and to go with some of the questions been asked, to promote these madrasas? Or has there been any real reform of the message, of the horrible message that's been given to young people throughout the Islamic world by these madrasas, which is filled with hate for the West and Israel, but the West as well?
I'll mention one, Congressman, a very recent one. Any imam who leaves Saudi Arabia to go to a conference or to go preach in a mosque anywhere else in the world has to have the permission of the government. And to get that permission, they do due diligence on what he's going to say, who he's going to speak to, what his own views are. And if an imam goes without permission, as was the case, or at least in one example I know, they are arrested and
And they're arresting him. Now, we are then trusting the group that's running Saudi Arabia to make sure that those people who are leaving are ideologically correct and philosophically going to promote a better world. Does our rest of our panel believe that that's the case? I find it very difficult to believe that the establishment in Saudi Arabia is censoring these folks in their madrasas, unless you can tell me. I guess you mentioned that you think they are. What about you? Do you think they are?
I think they've made some efforts, but no, I would not say it's nearly what it needs to be yet.
And I will have to say,
Can I just add on that point that the Saudis understand that their reputation here has taken a hit over the last at least 20 years. And the fact that somebody asked earlier, what can Congress do? The fact that Congress plays a bigger role and the kingdom leadership is beginning to understand that dealing with America is not as simple as just having a meeting with the president. So they do understand that Congress has a bigger role, as Ambassador Westfall said, representing the American public, and it is having an impact, not a cure, but a beginning impact on things like what you're discussing.
We're going to watch this very closely. I don't think that we can cross our fingers and try to pretend that bad things aren't happening, and then they'll just go away if we show we're friends. And I think there's been a lot of that irrational optimism that's gone into our relations with the Saudis over the years. Thank you very much.
Irrational exuberance, as our former Fed Reserve head said. Ms. Frankel of Florida.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. This has been a very interesting conversation here. Mr. Malinowski, you, in your testimony or in some answer, you said something about what was the real motive of the Saudis to cut off the ties from Qatar. What do you think was the real motive?
I think there were multiple and very complicated motives, and I think my first point was that the public talking point that it's just legitimate anger over Qatari funding for extremist groups around the world was probably not the first and most important reason. I think Saudi Arabia's most intense preoccupation over the last few years has been to combat what we can loosely refer to as the Arab Spring, the challenges in multiple countries in the region to established authoritarian regimes, coming from everything from liberal young kids who want to see democracy to the Muslim Brotherhood on the other side. And they one of their beefs with Qatar is that they view Qatar as having encouraged some of that, funded some of that, promoted it through Al Jazeera, which has a lot of stuff on it that I don't like, but also is a freewheeling space for freedom of speech, where people can criticize their governments and corruption and so forth. And this has led to a rivalry between the two states that has played out in the way that we have seen. There are a lot of other issues involved as well, where I don't think it's in the interest of the United States to take sides with one country or the other. It's in our interest to try to resolve this peacefully as quickly as possible.
Well, if I understand what you just said, is you think their primary motive actually sounds like the opposite of what they publicly said was their motive. I mean, if they does anyone else want to make a comment on
this? The Saudis believe that Qatar seeks to overthrow their regime, just like they believe the Iranians do, and that all of this terrorist financing is part of destabilizing their country. So it's very personal.
excuse me, that's not what I heard. What I heard Mr. Malinowski say is that
he wasn't willing to be as politically incorrect. As
listen. But what I heard him say, that's what I wanted to just make sure, is that they were trying to promote an Arab Spring type situation, which would be, I don't know, I interpret that as something different than promoting terrorism.
Let me put it this way.
All right.
ISIL wants to overturn the existing order, political order, in the Middle East. The United States, to the extent we believe in free elections and human rights, we want to overturn the existing political order in the Middle East. So does the Muslim Brotherhood in its own way. So do liberal human rights activists. So do a lot of people who are profoundly different from one another. The problem, I think, with Saudi policy sometimes is that they conflate all of these things as if they're part of one threat, whereas we, the United States, do not conflate all these things. We think it would be a good thing if dictatorships in the region evolved towards a more democratic form of government. We are at war with ISIL, and we want to make sure that our allies are with us primarily in that fight. We don't want to mix it up with all of these other things that are, frankly, less legitimate and appropriate from our point of view.
All right. Someone else made a comment about the United States, I think, needs to do more than just sell arms to Saudi Arabia. There was a comment that we should support Vision 2030, and I'm not. Could you tell me what some ideas would be for that?
I think there are two components to Vision 2030. One is the economic side, and of course, there is a great deal of interest on the part of the Saudis to see more U.S. investment, to see more engagement by the U.S. private sector in helping economic diversification is a big part of the Vision 2030, and so the United States and American private sector could potentially be a major partner in helping to implement those parts of the Vision 2030. But Vision 2030, of course, goes beyond that and also includes a major fundamental reshaping of what has always been understood as a social contract in Saudi Arabia between government and the citizens. The idea being that government would provide cradle-to-grave services. They would provide free health, free education, housing, jobs as the major employer. And so they are fundamentally reshaping that, and they're moving away from that and now talking about the role of the private sector as the major employer. They're reducing subsidies. They're doing a lot of other things that make them less of that cradle-to-grave social support, social safety net that they used to be. And therefore, that's also changing the way the people relate to the government. If you're not going to provide the services, the understanding before was that the people would stay out of government, they'd stay out of public policy in exchange for all of these services. If you're not going to provide the services, then there is an assumption that the people will have a greater say in the public policy and some of the basic decisions that the government is going to make. And so we can help foster that. We can help through some of our programs. We can help build up the capacity on the part of people to understand how to engage. What are the roles of non-governmental organizations and civil society and other things that would allow them to be a stronger voice, a stronger advocate for political liberalization, hopefully.
Can I add one point to this that I think is even more significant beyond the economic piece, and that is the social cultural reforms that the transformation is putting forth. So the latest version of this is that women who must have a guardian approve all of their legal actions, their education, their travel, their visa, everything. Now there's a new law that was just passed a few weeks ago that allows women now to not use a guardian, to be free, not in every single case, but yeah, it was just approved. No? That's what I heard.
View all the ministries to list their restrictions where they ask a woman to have a guardian, but he has not yet removed. You still have to have a guardian to get out of prison. You have to have a guardian to get married, which most women say is totally un-Islamic. So there is a review, but there is not yet a change. The hope is by women that the fact of asking for the review means the change will come. And there are people who believe that after Ramadan, it ends at the end of June, there is a chance women will be allowed to drive. You know, there is a hope of a lot of social change, and there is already, as I was trying to say, there is some social change. I probably didn't do a good job describing it, but they understand that they can't expect people to manage their own lives in this new private economy with the government controlling everything.
Wild times in the kingdom. Thank you, Ms. Frankel. Mr. Meadows, who is my occasional member of Congress when I go with my family for a week in North Carolina, and now you're threatening to take that away, you and the Freedom Caucus? Come on.
Well, based on past history, I think your August recess is probably safe.
All right. Look forward to being in North Carolina. Mr. Meadows.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank each of you for your testimony. So let me make sure I've got this right. Ms. House, you are supportive of the $110 billion arms deal to the Saudis. Is that correct?
Yes, I mean, I am not an arms expert, but yes, selling weapons so long as we
You and I don't need an interpreter. We use 3 or 4 syllables for every word, don't we? But thank you. All right, Ms. Malinowski, Mr. Malinowski, you're opposed to it. Is that correct?
I'm opposed to the PGMs. First of all,
and you're opposed to that for what reason?
I'm opposed to it because it is an offensive weapon that is being used right now in ways that we have advised repeatedly the Saudis not to use, to strike targets that are exacerbating.
So apparently, for humanitarian purposes, let me make sure I understand this, because right now they've knocked out bridges and so forth in Yemen, and that's why you're opposed to them. Is that correct?
We have given them lists of targets that they should not strike, and they have continued to strike those targets, at least up until the point where I was an Assistant Secretary of State. I think Congressman.
So if that's the case, would you not agree that the strategic ability of those arms has nothing to do with whether they hit a bridge or not?
I think that...
Because you're making a circular reasoning. You're saying you don't want them to be strategically able to do it, but they're going to do it regardless. So what does that have to do with the arms sales?
I don't. I think it makes the United States complicit in something that we have tried to stop.
So it would be better if we sold them non-strategic arms where they could bomb everything and eventually get the bridge.
Absolutely not. I think we should sell them defensive arms that are in keeping with
Mr. Firestein said that it actually helped, from a humanitarian standpoint, make sure that their strategic target actually gets hit the first time instead of the second or third time.
Well, we don't want it to be hit. That's the point.
But my whole point is it doesn't matter if they're going to hit it regardless. I mean, whether it's a strategic weapon or not, they're still going to take out the bridge.
Well, perhaps we should then sell these weapons to the Russians in Syria, because after all...
All right, well, let's go there, because what you're suggesting, let's go there. So you're suggesting that we should stay out of it. Is that correct? We should take a neutral position as it relates to Qatar versus Saudi. I think that was your sworn testimony. Is that correct?
Qatar versus Saudi, yes. I think we should do what Secretary Tillerson is trying to do, which is to try to resolve this.
So they're exactly the same as they relate to their support for terrorism?
No, they're not exactly the same. But
so then why should we take a neutral position?
Because we have an interest. First of all, we have a very strong alliance relationship with both countries.
I agree. I've got to go because I've got to meet the Qatari ambassador here in just a couple of seconds. So let me ask you this. How do we send, according to your testimony, a very clear signal on what we should or should not tolerate when we take a neutral position?
I think we can send a very strong signal to both countries about what we do and do not tolerate, as I think we've been doing.
But your whole testimony has said that we need to make sure that we're clear. And when we take a neutral position, that does not clarify our position from a diplomatic standpoint. So how do we take a clear position from a neutral point of view?
We should not be neutral with respect to behavior by other country that we disapprove of, but that does not mean that we necessarily should be supporting a blockade or potentially acts of war by one country against another that would not be in our interest to support.
All right, so how do we send a clear message? What would be the message I should take to the ambassador here in just a couple of minutes? What should be the message that I take it from a non-neutral point of view? Because I'm not neutral in this. You know, I think we have to be very clear that when there is an enemy, we expect our allies to support our position. Wouldn't you agree with that?
I absolutely do, and I think
That I thought you would. That was a softball. So what should I tell them?
I think if you've got a concern, and I assume you do, about Qatari support.
I'm assuming that you don't.
I do.
Okay,
I'm not,
so we share a concern.
I don't approve of anyone who supports Hamas.
All right. So if we're doing that, what should be the message?
Message should be cut it out. But that doesn't mean that we support a blockade by Saudi Arabia against a country that is hosting our troops in the middle of a war against ISIS, when Saudi Arabia also has some of those problems, which I hope you will raise with the Saudi ambassador when you meet him.
Well, I have, and I'll be glad to do that. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I'm in Congress. So let's look at that. If we're saying cut it out, how do we enforce that? Is it just a phone call and all of a sudden a member from North Carolina says cut it out and they're going to do that?
I think it's pretty clear, given the stakes involved in this crisis, that it is extremely important to both Qatar and Saudi Arabia and the UAE and other countries in the region to have the support of the United States. And I think we should be very
So we
stingy.
should threaten that they won't have this support.
We should be very stingy in offering that support to both Qatar and to Saudi Arabia and focus on being supportive of the efforts of Secretary Tillerson. I've been critical of him on other things.
So how do
doing the right thing here?
But
to try
how
to
do we
resolve this.
distinguish? See, you're saying be neutral. Is if one is doing a better job than the other, then we can't be neutral, Mr.
You have to
Malinowski.
be a mediator, and that's what this situation calls for. It's a mediation between two sides on the opposite side of a dispute. If you go into that and you say, I'm on their side 100%, you can't be a mediator.
I don't think anybody sees us in that form. I yield back, Madam Chair.
What a great hearing. Thank you, Mr. Meadows. Mr. Schneider.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. And again, I want to thank the witnesses for your testimony, for being here, and for your work in the conversation we're having on clearly not a simple issue. I want to start, Ambassador Firestein, you say in your testimony that Saudi Arabia, I'm going to quote you, are replicating a similar hopeful moment from 8 years earlier and call it a reset. Where do you see them making a mistake if you do in this hopefulness that they saw from 8 years ago?
Well, I think that 8 years ago, in 2009, the Saudis, as well as many of the other states in the region, were very frustrated with the Bush administration, frustrated with the mismanagement of the Iraq invasion and occupation, as well as some of the assertions by either members of the Bush administration or those associated with them concerning a very aggressive policy of regime change, of structural political change in the region that might be imposed through force. So when President Obama came into power, there was a sense that he was going to change the approach. He made a very well-received speech at Cairo University in 2009, where he talked about a new kind of relationship between the United States and the region, where he had pledged to withdraw forces from Iraq. And so they saw that as an antidote, if you will, to the things that they disliked about the Bush administration. As we went along, some of the issues that we've discussed over the course of this hearing began to change their perception of the Bush administration. They were of the Obama, excuse me, of the Obama administration, and so the unhappiness about the way Obama was addressing things, whether we're talking about the Arab Spring, throwing Hosni Mubarak under the bus, if you will, perception that was widely held in the region, unhappy about what we were doing in Syria, unhappy, as I think Ambassador Westfall outlined, not so much about the JCPOA, but about what they saw as the failed commitment of the Obama administration to address these other issues. That was really what the problem was. It was that the Obama administration had basically said, if you support us on the JCPOA, if you go along with this, we will pledge that we will continue to take a very strong position on Iran's other activities. It's expansionism, it's support for terrorism, it's support for a number of other things. And then they believe that the Obama administration didn't do that. So now we have a new administration in Washington, which is promising to basically return or to repair some of the things that they hated about Obama. And so we're going back to a very strong defense and security cooperation relationship. We're supporting them on Yemen. We're not going to press them on human rights. Those things make them helpful.
Because I have only limited time, I understand if I can turn to you, Mr. Malinowski, you talk about in this reset. I suspect that some of the frustration the Saudis had with previous administrations is that we came with expectations, that we came with certain priorities and values that reflected our interests. And you've raised the concern that we're witnessing something different this time, again, from your written testimony and a policy rebalance that may not necessarily serve our national interests and may leave us with challenges. I was hoping you could expand on that a little bit.
Well, I was trying to put this in a more global context. I think how we should engage with Saudi Arabia is a difficult question that we've debated within certain limits for many years. It's a close ally. We have to be engaged with them on a lot of different issues. We have concerns about some of their conduct domestically and internationally. We have to balance these things. Ambassador Firestein and I, we had dozens of conversations about this when we served. We usually agreed. Sometimes we had a different emphasis, and that's very normal. What I find very striking about the direction that the Trump administration has gone in is that it seems that the president, at least, has simply a far greater comfort level dealing with authoritarian family-run regimes in the Middle East than he does with our closest democratic allies in the world that have fought and bled with us, that share our values, that contribute everything they possibly can to our common security. And I think that contrast is what is creating questions around the world that people are wondering, what do we stand for and who do we stand with? And has that fundamentally changed?
I agree with you, and I have the concern of if we don't stand by our principles and values, that people can't look to our nation and have a clear sense of who we are and what we are trying to achieve domestically and internationally. That sends very dangerous signals to the rest of the world. So I thank you for that. And I know I'm out of time, so I appreciate for the extended time. I will just add, and for perhaps written consideration, the arms sale, as you have all talked about before, and the threat it poses to our closest ally, most strategic ally in the region, Israel, I think it's imperative for the administration to make very clear that we will ensure and protect Israel's qualitative military edge, not just in the context of selling these weapons to Saudi Arabia, but God forbid any of these weapons were to get into the hands of non-state actors. So with that, I
Excellent point. Thank you, Mr. Schneider. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you again to our witnesses. My first question, Ambassador Firestein, is what do you think is Saudi Arabia's endgame in Yemen? It doesn't seem as if they have been able to militarily prevail or been successful in bringing about a diplomatic resolution. What do you think is the end game?
Well, I think that that's it's actually the big problem is that there is no clear end game. I think that the Saudis, like we, in 2015, thought that we would be able to very quickly restore stability, have the Hadi government go back to power in Sana'a, and continue the political transition there. It hasn't worked out that way. Like Ambassador Westfall, I believe that the Saudis have been looking for a political way out of this conflict for at least the last year or a year plus. They entered into a dialogue with the Houthis to try to bring the Houthis away from the Iranian relationship and to support the political dialogue. I think we were all very hopeful last summer that there was going to be a political agreement in Kuwait in the negotiations led by the UN. That failed, and we've been trying to get back to that point ever since. I still believe that the Saudis would be very interested in and would welcome a political way forward. What we need to focus on is how we can get back to that UN negotiation and hopefully have a different outcome this time.
Thank you. Mr. Malinowski, you look like you wanted to add something. No. So I think we're all familiar with the horrific human rights record of Saudi Arabia under Sharia law, beheading protesters and condemning young people to death for crimes they committed as children, flogging bloggers for perceived insults. And Mr. Malinowski, I'd ask you whether you have seen any evidence of any improvement in their human rights record, and what is the impact of the president agreeing to an arms sale without attempting to use that desire from the Saudis as a way to leverage or at least raise some expectation that they improve their behavior with respect to universal human rights?
I agree with my colleagues here that there have been some modest signs of potential improvement. I'm qualifying that very, very carefully. You have less of the religious police out on the streets abusing people. There is this potential move on the guardianship system that Ms. House described. But fundamentally, these problems do persist. And although I think 95%, 98% of the dynamic that may lead to change is going to come from within Saudi Arabia, I do think there is a role for Saudi Arabia's friends in raising these issues and debating them publicly to create, in the minds of those in Saudi Arabia who care about the kingdom's reputation, the sense that they have to keep moving in this direction. And I think it has been efficacious on specific cases. I've no question about that. In terms of the arms sale, I've never said that we should hold up arms sales to Saudi Arabia because of their general human rights record. I'm a pragmatist about this. But I do think where a specific weapon system is being used in the commission of human rights abuses, then I think we have a different kind of obligation and have to have a different kind of debate.
Thank you. A significant portion of global terrorist funding emanates from Saudi Arabia, and I know that in the past, United States officials have been frustrated at the limited capacity of Saudi authorities to clamp down on those funding streams. And I wonder whether in anyone's judgment the situation has improved over the last few years. Has the United States been supportive of Saudi efforts to rein in terrorist financing? What more can we do? What more can they do? But this, it appears to remain a serious problem. Ambassador, it looks like you have some thoughts.
Can I just say I was the #2 in our Bureau of Counterterrorism in 2006 and 7 when we were very focused at that time on the issue of counterterror finance. We had strong concerns about the records of all of the states in the Gulf about their ability, their willingness to actually intercede effectively and aggressively to try to cut off the flow of financing to some of these violent extremist organizations. I would have to say that in my own view, while we have not had success in any particular complete way, all of them are better today than they were 10 years ago. All of them have taken steps. I do believe, actually, that the President's approach in Riyadh when he was speaking to the assembled Arab and Islamic leaders was the right approach, which is the need to build up a broad-based coalition, build a consensus that all of the states need to do a better job, need to take on this issue aggressively. I think that that's the right way to go forward. Unfortunately, where we are right now is that effort to build a coalition is being blown apart by this conflict that we have right now with Qatar. And therefore, I agree absolutely with Assistant Secretary Malinowski and with my other colleagues that what we need to do is help resolve that issue peacefully and get back to that coalition and consensus-building effort that we were engaged in just a few weeks ago.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. And now we turn to the Twitter ninja of the House, par excellence, my friend, Mr. Liu of California.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
That Twitter game is strong.
Thank you. I don't think any of us here objects to the United States assisting our ally, Saudi Arabia. But what many members of Congress do object to on a bipartisan and bicameral basis is that the Saudi-led military coalition has committed multiple war crimes in Yemen, and the U.S. is aiding and abetting in those war crimes. In addition to refueling some of these Saudi jets that strike civilians, we've also sold them weapons that have struck civilians. And this freaked people out so much that the State Department lawyers actually started looking at, can our military personnel and other personnel be liable for war crimes under international law for this assistance? And so my first question to you, Secretary Malinowski, is, did the State Department attorneys finish that review or come to a conclusion, do you know, before you left?
I would say before I left, they raised these concerns and made them known to policymakers. I don't know whether work has continued on that effort.
The reason that the Obama administration stopped the sale of precision-guided munitions was because the Saudi-led military coalition were using these munitions to target civilians. It's not as if they were trying to hit a tank and they accidentally hit a hospital. They very precisely hit hospitals. They very precisely hit schools. They very precisely hit a wedding party with lots of civilians. They very precisely hit a large funeral twice with the munitions. So the problem is we're now enabling Saudi Arabia coalition to precisely kill civilians. And that was what was such a huge problem. And now that the Trump administration wants to reverse, Ted Yoho and I and other bipartisan members of Congress wrote a very simple letter to the State Department and Department of Defense basically asking, hey, you just tell us, has the conduct of the Royal Saudi Air Force changed so that they're no longer precisely hitting civilians with weapons that the United States sells them? That letter is dated April 6th. So we got a response on April 26th from the Secretary of Defense, response on May 2nd from the Secretary of State. They basically were non-responsive letters. So, Madam Chairwoman, I'd like to enter these letters in.
Without
the record.
objection.
I want to ask the panel, have you seen changes in the operative conduct of their Saudi-led military coalition so that they are not striking civilians anymore, or are they continuing to do the same thing?
Mr. Liu, you and I had an opportunity to have a conversation about these issues several times when I was still with the State Department. And I have to say that I disagree with the premise of your question. I don't believe that the Saudis did precisely hit civilians or specifically target civilians.
That's wrong. In the funeral case, the Saudi Arabia military acknowledged they hit that funeral. They sued there might be some rebels there, but they intended to strike that funeral. They intended to hit it, and they did.
Mr. Liu, if you recall exactly what the explanation was, they did acknowledge that they hit the funeral, and I have to say that friends of mine were killed in that funeral home, so I feel very strongly.
Right, and they weren't trying to hit a tank.
But
they were trying to hit that funeral, and they did.
But they acknowledged, sir, that they were basing that on the basis of wrong intelligence. They acknowledged that they hit it, but there was a mistake that was based on poor intelligence that they had received, that was actually a military.
Right, and the weapons enabled that to happen. And
sir, they could have hit it with a dumb
if it's
bomb
one
just as
funeral,
easily.
I get it. Maybe if it's two funerals, I get it. When it's 70-some airstrikes documented by multiple organizations, then it's a pattern of either gross incompetence or direct targeting of civilians.
Sir, I have to.
So I'm just asking, has that conduct changed?
I would have to say again that the issue is not that they were targeting, and I think
in that case, they were targeting their funeral. They were targeting the funeral. Is that correct?
They acknowledge that they hit the funeral based on wrong intelligence.
So they were targeting the funeral and they hit it.
But they did not realize it was a funeral. They did not target.
They hit a Doctors
They
Without Borders
targeted what
hospital.
they understood was a military target.
They hit a Doctors with Borders hospital. They intended to hit that hospital.
And I think that if you go back and look at the bipartisan investigations that have been done on many of those instances,
they weren't bipartisan. They were done by
made,
the Saudi Arabian military itself.
You would see that, in fact, the situation was not the way it was portrayed in the press. And
What
that
was the
some of those-
bipartisan investigation you're talking about?
That there is.
What is the bipartisan investigation you're talking
There is a group
about?
of people who have undertaken investigations at the behest of the Saudis, who are not Saudi, and who take a look at these things and have come back and issued reports. And those reports are available publicly. And you can see that in some of these instances, what was considered to be a strike on a Médecins Sans Frontières hospital or other kinds of targets, that in fact there were legitimate military targets that were co-located or very nearby, and that they were not targeting these facilities, but in fact there was collateral damage from hits on legitimate targets. So this is a much more complicated.
All right, so my time up.
situation.
So I just want to make sure that you are really saying this. You're saying the strike on a Doctors Without Borders hospital was a legitimate strike?
I think that it was not a strike on a Doctors Without Borders hospital. It was a strike on a
They pretty much
co-located
demolished
military
it.
facility.
Thank you,
I
Mr.
yield.
Liu. And I think Mr. Deutsch wanted to make a statement.
I did. I was just hoping, Madam Chairman, before you adjourn the hearing, I was hoping that you might introduce the newest members of our subcommittee who are with us today.
Well, I am so pleased to be joined by two of our eldest granddaughters, Morgan, who will be 8 on July 15, and Caroline, who just turned 5 last week, so she says she's going to be 6. And with that, thank you, Mr. Deutsch. With that, our subcommittee will now be adjourned. Excellent panelists, excellent questions. Thank you to the audience.
Sarah, did you grab that book? You grab both of them? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Yes, we don't know when, but we're working on it. Yeah.